was also an assistant curator there, and she had developed a wonderful exhibition on African hair combs, 6,000 years of African hair combs, looking at hair combs for African people that had been created as art forms and spiritual forms in Kemet. Beginning with that right to the time of the Black Power movement, and the hair comb there with the fist on it that symbolized the movement, and until the current time. So she is also connected to Kemet Expert, which she created herself. When I say connected, she's actually the creator of Kemet Expert, which you can find online because it's actually an online educational course. Not really course, you can go into it and you can discover things and add to it and learn from it. And now, I don't know if I've said enough, Dr. Ashton, that course started, or the online information knowledge base started in about 2016. But is that okay, or is there, I mean, there's so much, you've written so much and published so much, so I was just sort of trying to touch on the, highlight some of the things in relation to my personal relationship.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Duff. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Nahuzi, Dr. Kimani Nahuzi is an international scholar. And as I said, both Dr. Nahuzi and Dr. Ashton are actually community activists. And Dr. Nahuzi has been known for his activism even before he was known for his academic work. And he is an African by way of via Guyana. So, and I met him while he was teaching, a professor teaching at East London University. So I was very honored to meet Dr. Nahuzi, because he's a man of many disciplines. I mean, also to do with going to Kemet, going to the Sudan, and his film work and images and ideas, also being able to read the Nebmaatre and actually teach. And I forgot to say that Dr. Kimani is a colleague in the Department of Africology, so he actually teaches about Kemet, how to read the Nebmaatre. He's also a linguist, and one of his great works is his book on libation, where he looks to libation, the early libation in Kemet, and develops an understanding of the nature of culture around libation, the nature of spirituality, and the images that represent ancient forms of libation, which really are not much different from the modern forms, but it's very important for us to be able to go back to see the early representations and have that knowledge about ourselves. He's an associate professor in our department, and he is also, as I said before, actually committed to social change and has been working in that area from when he was young. So I don't know if that's all right, Dr. Nahuzi, if you'd like to add anything. I know you've got tons of work. Both of you have published well. So if there's anything that you want to add.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dove. I do not wish to add anything. Please proceed.
Okay, well, that's really the introduction of you both. And, you know, I think, Dr. Ashton, if you're ready to begin with your talk, at the end or sometime, anytime, Dr. Kimani will jump in and elaborate on something that might need, you know, his particular perspective on it, because you're both working together in this. But thank you very much, Dr. Ashton.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dove. I'd like to thank you and Dr. Asante for the invitation to speak this afternoon, your time this evening in the UK. It's a great honour to do so, and also to thank Miss Wilson for all of her help, which was wonderful. So thank you. I really appreciate that, and it's wonderful to be able to present with Dr. Nahusi this evening, and I hope that he will be regularly jumping in as I sort of share just some evidence, really, because that's what this evening is about. It's about sharing evidence, and my work has always been very much, whether I'm an archaeologist or a psychologist, is very much focused on the evidence that we have rather than what we want to impose, particularly onto the past. And I'm sad to say, in the discipline of Egyptology, I see a lot of imposing with little reference to evidence, and that for me is problematic and really explains why the discipline is still in the situation, the state that it currently is. I feel that it hasn't really progressed very much in the last 100 or so years. So, oh, I can't, there we go. Dr. Dove has already mentioned my background. Originally I studied classics. I then did a PhD in Egyptology, and I specialised in the Ptolemaic period. I worked at the British Museum, Petrie Museum, and as Dr. Dove said, the Fitzwilliam Museum. And then after working in prisons with mainly Black British prisoners, exploring ways in which cultural heritage could be used to support men and women who had offended with their rehabilitation and reforming their identity, I decided to retrain in criminology and psychology and did a master's degree in each. Finished my second PhD last year, focusing on adolescent gangs, but more broadly looking at social psychology as well. And I'm going to be referring to elements of social psychology this evening and later towards the third part of my lecture. I'd like to start just briefly. I'm sure that many people here are aware about Cleopatra, the last Cleopatra as she was, but you know, what do we really know about her? Well, we know that her grandfather was Ptolemy IX, that her grandmother was unknown. We know that her father was Ptolemy XII, Neos Dionysos, the new Dionysos, and that her mother was uncertain. She had two sisters, Cleopatra Berenike IV, who was murdered, and Arsinoe IV, who was executed on the order of Mark Antony. We know that she ruled with her two brothers. The first was drowned in the River Nile. The second was murdered to make way for Cleopatra's son. We know that she had a child with Julius Caesar, Ptolemy Caesar, or Caesarion, as he's sometimes referred to, and that she had three children with Mark Antony, Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Helios, who were twins, and Ptolemy Philadelphos. So that's roughly what we know about her. There's an issue whether she was Cleopatra VII or the VI. So the confusion starts already, even in terms of the number that we should give her. And of course, none of the rulers had numbers at the time. These are just to make life simple for us because they all have very, very similar names. Cleopatra V, Tryphina, was the sister of Ptolemy XII, and they had the aforementioned Cleopatra Berenike. Ptolemy XII was exiled, at which point Cleopatra V ruled with, we think, Cleopatra Berenike, her daughter. However, the writer, historian Porphyry, and this is where the confusion comes in. So the last Cleopatra is probably Cleopatra VI, but Porphyry confused matters by saying there was another Cleopatra, another daughter of Cleopatra Tryphina V and Ptolemy XII, and she was named the Cleopatra VI. So Cleopatra Berenike was put to death by her father when he returned from exile. And then Ptolemy XII took the throne with Cleopatra, the one we know as the 7th, as his co-ruler. But upon his death, he had stated that Cleopatra should rule with her brother, who was Ptolemy XIII. And I'd just like to pause for a moment, because actually, you know, often, and I was very guilty of this as an archaeologist and somebody who specialized in this period, and that's that, you know, we reel off, you know, murdered, executed, exiled, without really thinking about the impact that that must have had on Cleopatra as a human, as a human being. And I think that's something that's perhaps central to her personality and also her identity. And I think it's fair to say that both her personality and her identity were very strong. There seems, from the evidence that I'm going to run through this evening, that Cleopatra had a very clear way in which she wished to be shown and depicted. And actually, the confusion isn't when we look at her contemporary times and how she presented herself when she was alive. The confusion, the appropriation, and has really something that has happened more recently and continues to be the case. And I'll come back to that in the final part of the presentation today. Of course, the Ptolemies were Greek Macedonians by descent. On the left, we have Cleopatra's grandfather, who was Ptolemy IX, also called Soter, the savior, and he was nicknamed Chickpea, Lathyros. And her father on the right-hand side, who was Ptolemy XII, he called himself Neos Dionysos, the new Dionysos, and Philopator, father-loving. But he was also known as Nothos, which means illegitimate, and he was also known as Auletes, which is means a flute player. So although, as I've mentioned, the Ptolemaic dynasty were Macedonian Greeks, in terms of Cleopatra's ancestry, we have the missing components of her grandmother and her mother. And it's been suggested that these two women were indigenous Egyptian women. This has led to people to question her racialized and cultural identity. I think we will now look at the archaeological record as well, because I think for me, how she presented herself as the ruler, amongst other things, of Egypt, and I will call it Egypt because at that time it was referred to as Egypt rather than Kemet. If we look at the archaeological record, it's very clear that she only presented herself as an Egyptian, as somebody using the Kemetic tradition, when she was represented in her home country. Now, about 5 or 6 years ago, the body of the woman who was assumed to be Cleopatra's sister or half-sister, we're not sure because again the mother is unknown, Arsinoe, was found in Ephesus. And we know that from the grave it's been suggested that this was an important woman. And the skull was recently re-examined about 5 years ago. And it was reconstructed. And the image that you see on the left is a reconstruction from the Unit for Forensic and Medical Arts at Dundee University. And the quote that accompanied the explanation said, "Although it is not possible to tell the exact skin, eye and hair colour from the skull, the historical background information, shape of the skull are suggestive of a mixed ancestry." So we have this information as well. Now, I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk because I think it's really interesting for me that the media, academics even, and it's not just the media, it's also colleagues, insist on ignoring this fact. They insist on ignoring this information. And for me, that's very insightful in terms of where we are looking at Egyptology as a discipline, but also how we look at the past. I don't know if Dr. Nahusi would like to say anything about that before I continue with the presentation of Cleopatra, looking at some of the evidence.
Thanks for the invitation, Zalian. I would just say that a question for us, we may or may not be able to answer this fully or at all, is whether the missing identity of Cleopatra's mother and grandmother has anything to do with the fact that they're women in a male-dominated field. It's something I think that we should ask ourselves. And like I said, we need not get an answer, but it's important to pose that question and see how far we get with it.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think hopefully that's something we can come back to again at the end when we've had a look at some of the evidence. I think that's a really important point to make, absolutely. So I want now to have a look at the presentation of Cleopatra at home and then briefly abroad. So if we look at the temples where Cleopatra dedicated, they're actually concentrated in the south of the country. There are three, this evidence is very sort of scant, particularly at Coptos, Gebtu and Armant as well. We have obviously more information from the famous temple at Dendra, although interestingly, the friezes and the reliefs on the inside of that temple are largely ignored by scholars. Most people will be familiar with the south wall that I showed at the start of this presentation, but there are countless images of Cleopatra within the temple itself. Bob Bianchi, who's also a Ptolemaic specialist, suggested in 2003 that there was possible evidence for reliefs that had been reused by Augustus, so recarved effectively, that could have related to Cleopatra at Calabsha. That's something else to bear in mind. There was also a temple dedicated to the goddess Isis in Alexandria, and I'll come to that at the end. The Geb shrine at Coptos is the evidence is very poorly preserved here, and this is an old sort of archival photograph showing a lone female figure, Cleopatra herself, making offerings to the deities. It's very unusual in the Ptolemaic period, but also prior to this, for a female to be without her consort. And as we've seen, Cleopatra had a number of consorts during her time. And this really is testimony to her independence as a ruler. On the left-hand side, you can see one of her predecessors, and that is Cleopatra III, with Cleopatra's grandfather, Ptolemy IX. And here, highly unusual, Cleopatra III, who was in fact the dominant ruler at the time, she selected her son to rule with her, is making an offering to the god Amun, and she's standing in front of her son. Highly unusual, but again, it's testimony to the independence of the women from this dynasty. Also from Coptos is a fragment of a statue in the Petrie Museum. And you can see on the left-hand side, it has three cobras on the sun disk. And I'll come back to this because this is something that it seems I have argued to be associated with Cleopatra, the final Cleopatra in particular. And the titles on the back of the crown are King's Sister, King's Daughter, and Royal Wife. And this was found in a location close to an earlier Ptolemaic temple, Temple of Min and Hathor or Isis. It was sometimes identified as a crown for an earlier Ptolemaic queen, but as we'll see shortly, it's only really the final Cleopatra who wears three cobras. That was something that was quite new and distinct in terms of her iconography. At the site of Armant, very little stands today. I took the image on the right-hand side, and yes, it is upside down, but it's actually placed upside down when I visited the site, which must be about 10 years ago now. You can see the state of preservation is actually quite poor. And here again, we have a reference to Cleopatra, Philopator, a reference to her father. But the main interest of this particular site was a birth house that was built by Cleopatra. And sadly, it was completely destroyed and the stones were reused. So this doesn't exist. This is the only photograph that we have of the temple. And the drawing on the left-hand side, which is in Lepsius, shows a remarkable birthing scene with a reference to Cleopatra's son above the winged Khepri. And we see Cleopatra standing here, the cartouche was left blank, watching the birth of her son. So this is a remarkable image, sadly lost. All we have are photographs from the site, and all we have are Lepsius's drawings, but there's a whole sequence of drawings of nursing and caring for the newborn child, which it is believed is Cleopatra's son. That's why she's looking on, the young Horus. And Alexandria, people always think of Alexandria as a very Greek city. That's not true at all. Very early on, even before I completed my first PhD, just looking at the evidence, documentary evidence in the museum and piecing together the archaeology, it became very clear to me that actually Alexandria was a very Egyptian city in terms of its appearance, and it had been from the early Ptolemaic period. So this is a reconstruction on the left of a colossal dyad. The central figure you see is a representation of the goddess Isis. It's assumed that it's Cleopatra. And that's in Mariemont in Belgium. And the male statue clearly has the portrait features of a young man and represents Cleopatra's son, her co-ruler, Caesarion. Back in 2002, I actually did quite a lot of work with my French colleagues in Alexandria. And I wanted to locate the temple. The image on the right shows you the head of the colossal male figure, just to give you an example of the size of it. It was a huge granite sort of dyad, and one of the legs from the statue as well, which is what's been preserved. And I was interested because I hypothesized that this could be the place where Cleopatra was laid to rest, which we know was close to a temple of Isis, or it was reported rather that it was close to a temple of Isis. So looking at old maps and imposing them onto a modern sort of map of Alexandria, which is, I'm sure those of you who've been will know that it's incredibly built up, the city. It's very difficult to see any archaeology. You have to have a vivid imagination when you are looking at the landscape for the topography. And you can see on the upper left-hand side that this is where the site was. We did gain access and we did find some large structures, as you can see from the map at the bottom. However, I was prevented by Hawass and the Supreme Council of Antiquities from continuing to work at this site. My permit was blocked the following year when I requested to go back. So I wasn't able to return. Any subsequent work I did was actually under the permit of my French colleagues at Karnak. And it was a great shame, really, that I wasn't able to return to continue to investigate the site, because for me, it was one of considerable interest. And there are other representations on the left-hand side. You can see from the underwater excavations around Alexandria, another representation of a young man. And this is doubtless has to be Ptolemy Caesar, Ptolemy Caesarion. And as soon as he was born, he became really important to Cleopatra, who really changed the role. And we'll have a look at that in respect to the titles in a moment. Even on coinage that was minted in Cyprus, which you see on the right-hand side, Cleopatra showed herself as a Hellenistic ruler and queen, as you can see from the reverse of this coin. And you can see just below her chin is a little blob, and that's the head of her son with Julius Caesar. Of note is the 2 cornucopias on the back of her coin, because there's only one other Ptolemaic queen, Arsinoe II, who had the double cornucopia. And it was actually the inclusion of the double form of this motif on the back of a coin that enabled me to identify a whole series of Egyptian style statues and representations that hitherto hadn't been recognized of the final Cleopatra. And of course, at Dendera, we see Cleopatra on the right. This is a mirror image on the south wall, and she stands behind her son, and they present to the gods. And as I said, at this temple, we see representations of Cleopatra with her son, both on the external and internal walls, but she also appears by herself in the form of a priestess and a chantress. So here on the right-hand side, the far right figure, you can see a representation. The cartouches are blank, but this crown that she's wearing, again, is a crown that's only worn by one other Ptolemaic queen, Arsinoe II. I'll come back to her shortly. So this here we are seeing Cleopatra, again, standing behind her son and holding a sistrum. Other images we see on the left-hand side, Cleopatra again holding Sistra with the head of Hathor in her hands, same crown. And on the right-hand side, she wears a more traditional crown, which is the double-plumed crown that we saw on the fragment of that sculpture from Coptos. Again, the cartouches are blank, but the iconography is very specific to this particular female ruler. Dr. Nahusi, is there anything that you would like to say about the temples before we have a look at the statues?
Nope, I'm good, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So as I said, prior to me doing the research for my PhD, we didn't really have any representations of Cleopatra. We only had 2, which were Greek-style representations that were actually found in Italy. So no direct connection to her as a historical figure and a ruler of her home country, of Egypt. This sculpture on the left-hand side is in the Hermitage Museum, and you can see that it's a traditional representation. What's unusual about it, however, is that in her left hand, she's holding the double form of the cornucopia, which, if you recall, we saw on those coins that were minted in Cyprus. And on her brow, she has 3 cobras, which is highly unusual. People will be aware of the double cobra. Obviously, that's associated specifically with the 25th dynasty male rulers, but also it was used prior to the later periods by royal women in particular. And having looked at the titles that are associated with it, it seems to identify them as the dominant royal female at any one time. So the statue in the middle has a cartouche on the right arm, on the right forearm, which is, scholars have questioned whether this is a forgery or whether it was part of the original sculpture. And you can see the sculpture is actually in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and it has a rather rudimentary cornucopia, but the 3 cobras are on the brow as well. You can see here from the hairstyles, they're traditional hairstyles, and the hairstyle in the center is something that was adopted later in the Roman period called Isis locks, because it was associated with the Roman depiction of the goddess Isis. But it was in fact actually first used by the Ptolemaic queens, and seems essentially to have been a representation of a natural hairstyle. It was really the discovery of these statues that, as I've said, that enabled us to look at how Cleopatra presented herself in a three-dimensional way, and supported the evidence of the two-dimensional reliefs on the temples. So for a long time we were missing this evidence. However, we knew about the temples, we had the depictions of her in a traditional format. And I think part of the problem has been really was that it was traditionally classical scholars, because this was the Ptolemaic period, who studied this period, and that very few Egyptologists, certainly when I did my PhD 20 years ago, things have started to change now, but very few Egyptologists could actually be bothered to look at this period. It was traditionally seen, even unofficially, as one of degeneration, and not a popular period or to study. And I think also because it requires you, if you're to look at it in its fullest sense, to know both, to have a background in classical studies and also Egyptology. Looking at it through either one or the other lens gives you a distorted impression. And I think what's interesting about Cleopatra, to my knowledge, there are no Greek-style representations of Cleopatra from Egypt. All of the representations refer back to a tradition of Kemet. She was never presented in a Hellenistic form in her homeland. And the sculpture on the left-hand side, very, very nearby in modern terms to the Metropolitan sculpture, is actually in Brooklyn Museum now. And is clearly based on a very similar model, but is more fragmentary and carved by a different sculptor, no doubt. But it has the three cobras again on the brow. So who was Cleopatra looking at as a role model? Well, I've mentioned Arsinoe. This is Arsinoe II, and another statue in the Metropolitan Museum at the bottom, a posthumous representation showing Arsinoe II as a goddess with a double cornucopia. Now, Arsinoe only ever wore a double uraeus, so two cobras on her brow. And it's been assumed that that was to differentiate her from Arsinoe I, who was her brother's first wife, but also this could have been awarded to her posthumously because she wasn't deified until after her death. So on the bottom right-hand side, you can see a depiction of her consort. This is following her death. Ptolemy II making an offering from the Temple of Isis at Philae, making an offering to the goddess Isis, and then standing behind her is the deified Arsinoe. And you may recognize that crown because it's the crown that Cleopatra wore on some of those reliefs at Dendra. So certainly Arsinoe was a role model. She was the first of the Ptolemaic females to be deified, albeit posthumously, but she was clearly a role model for the last Cleopatra. But if we go back further and look at multiple cobras, there's a long history of this going back to at least the New Kingdom and Dynasty 18. These are the earliest examples that I've been able to find. And one of the most famous sort of Kemite royal women to wear the multiple cobra, the double cobra, is the wife of Amenhotep, Nebmaatre, Tiye or Tiye. Now here, although initially it might look like she's wearing a triple cobra, the center of the three figures on the left-hand side is actually a vulture. And if you look very closely at this representation of her, you can just about see the wings of the vulture headdress, showing her as a goddess here sitting on top of her hair. So she wore at times and often these are representations of Upper and Lower Egypt. So referencing, they will wear the crowns. One of the cobras will wear the crown of Upper Egypt, the other cobra will wear the crown of Lower Egypt. Interestingly though, if we refer to the representation that's now in Berlin, the same queen, This statue at some point, the number of holes indicates that actually the double cobra, the double uraeus, was actually replaced with a single. And it's been suggested that this was possibly at the time when her son took his consort, that now was the time and was seen to be appropriate for her to revert back to a single cobra or a vulture on her brow. So for me, it's really interesting that Cleopatra, her advisors, looked back to a strong Kemetic tradition when they were looking at how they should best present this quite extraordinary, and she was extraordinary and unusual within her family, because she's the only Ptolemaic ruler that I'm aware of, and certainly the evidence suggests, did not ever represent herself as a Greek in Egypt. Many of the other rulers did, but not Cleopatra the seventh, or the last Cleopatra. Dr. Nothos, I've made a summary here of the titles that were, and I'm sure that you will want to comment on these and add to these. You're very much more of a specialist than I am in this particular area. But just as a summary, looking at the titles, and this is something that Dr. Nothos and I spoke about a couple of weeks ago. Nowhere is Cleopatra referred to in Egypt at home as a queen. She adopts three different roles: divine, a ruler, and a priestess. And the titles are on the left-hand side of the screen, but I'll hand over to Dr. Nothos, if I may.
Thanks, Ali. And I think you made the point that I want to make. I really don't want us to dive too deeply into this, but I think it's important that as we examine the evidence, we recognize that very often the terminology that we use in English or any other European language very often distorts the reality that we're looking at. And in this case, to refer to Cleopatra as a queen doesn't really exactly represent what she was in her own culture. A queen is very often ineffective in the European tradition. I don't think you could argue that about the office that Cleopatra held. And this is, so in African culture, the people we call queens had power in their own right, and they were very, very effective usually in representing themselves and their power. So we're looking at an office that is significantly different from what we should imagine when we say queen. And that's the major point I wanted to talk about here. I think we could, on other occasions, really dive very deeply, more deeply into this, but you know, it's just for us to consider that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nothos. And again, this is something I think we should come back to when we've completed the presentation. So Cleopatra's image was very carefully constructed, and it reflected her identity and the roles that she played. But of course, as a ruler of her own country, we know that she spent time in Rome, in Italy, and that she had dealings, obviously more than dealings. She was in a relationship with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, and had children with them. On the left-hand side, you can see the Vatican Cleopatra, and this for many years, along with a very similar representation that's in Berlin, was the only image that we had of Cleopatra. And as I've said, I think for me, it's really important that we show her both at home and also how she depicted herself overseas. And the two were related. I think the interesting thing for me is that the Europeans at this time were extremely limited because for the Romans it wasn't appropriate to, although ironically Augustus soon threw himself into the divine role, but it was seen to be unacceptable to declare yourself a living deity, and that was not something at the time in Republican Rome that was seen to be either religiously or culturally acceptable. So in many respects, Cleopatra seems to have had to adapt her position and how she presented herself, because actually the European tradition was more limited in terms of how women were represented. So Cleopatra, we know, was in Rome. We're not sure for how long, certainly before the birth of her son. It's believed that she gave birth to her son with Julius Caesar following Caesar's death, when she had returned to her home. But again, we're very dependent on the ancient writers and historians for this information. The representation on the left-hand side, again, was a statue that I identified, and it was previously just identified as a representation of Isis. It's from a temple of Isis, a late Republican temple of Isis in Rome. And you can see it's made out of marble and would have been gilded originally. It shows the hair, traditional hair. I don't like the fact that people refer to the hair on Egyptian representations, on Kemetic representations as well, as a wig. I think that's another way that people try to deny the racialized origins of the people of ancient Kemet. So you can see that her hair is styled in a way that it would be styled at home. And she would have had a vulture head here. She's wearing a vulture headdress, showing her as a goddess. And we know that also that Julius Caesar dedicated a representation showing Cleopatra at the Temple of Venus Genetrix at the Forum. And it's seen by many Roman historians that this was the final straw for Caesar's colleagues and the people of Rome, because now he was recognizing this outside woman as a goddess, and not only was he putting a representation of her in any temple, this was a very important temple according to Roman religion. So even though it was something that the Romans couldn't get their heads around at the time, Cleopatra was still, rightly so, according to her own tradition, depicting herself as a goddess as well as a queen, which is what we see on the back of coins. Internationally, the coins are international. They were minted in lots of different places. I found this coin on the left-hand side, which is minted Patras, and it shows Cleopatra as the younger goddess, queen and younger goddess, and there's a representation on the reverse of that coin showing the crown of Isis or Hathor. And of course, the famous coins that were minted post-Actium with Mark Antony. These are external. This is her international image. And they're quite separate and very different, as you can see, from how she represented herself at home. And I just want to now reflect before we discuss perhaps in more detail that actually the issue around who Cleopatra was is a contemporary problem. It seems to me, as somebody who studied Cleopatra for over 20 years, that she knew exactly who she was and was very careful in how she depicted herself, and also how she connected to her role as an African ruler. I can see somebody's raised their hands. Would probably about another 5 minutes. Could we wait until the discussion, or would you like to ask the question now? Okay, I can't hear anything. So perhaps if we could wait until literally just 3 or 4 more slides. I just want to remind us from a psychological standpoint, because I think this is what many people seem to be suffering from, or perhaps it's ignorance. So cognitive dissonance, perfectly summarized by Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist, Sometimes people hold a core belief that's very strong. When they're presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that's extremely uncomfortable called cognitive dissonance. And because it's so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit with that core belief. And I think this is what we see in terms of people's responses to who Cleopatra was. Either that, or as I've said, ignorance. Cleopatra is often just seen as this sort of inactive, lack of agency female figure. I'm happy to see that the National Theatre production of Antony and Cleopatra in 2018 selected, in my opinion, a more appropriate actor to play her role. But on the left-hand side, when I discovered this statue that was in the basement of the Louvre Museum, when we were looking for objects for the exhibition at the British Museum in 2000, the Egyptian press were enraged by this. You can see it's got a triple uraeus, which is 3 cobras, which is why I identified it as Cleopatra. And in the Egyptian press, people were quoted as saying that it was too ugly to be Cleopatra, so therefore it couldn't represent her. You know, I've never, you know, and I'm happy to stand corrected, but I've never really experienced male historical figures or rulers being spoken about in this way. The other problem is that people seem to go back to Shakespeare's Cleopatra. There's no need to do that. That's nothing to do with the original Cleopatra. But I've seen that again recently with the controversy of who should play Cleopatra in an up-and-coming film. Controversially, I've spoken about this before, but I'll just show the images. I was asked to reconstruct Cleopatra. What would she have looked like for a television documentary back in 2008, and this was the finished result. It was taken from that statue that I showed you from Rome on the left-hand side. But interestingly, I was working remotely with the people who were doing the computer-generated image. You can see when they started to impose it, they changed the features of the statue. And the reason that I'd selected that sculpture was that it was just over life size, and actually it was pretty much intact, and for me offered a good example of a possible portrait of her. After much toing and froing, this was the final result, and there was a public outcry. A tabloid newspaper, the Daily Mail, got hold of this, and I remember very clearly I was working in prisons at the time. And I came out of prison and checked my phone in the car, and everybody was saying, you're in the Daily Mail, and that's never good. It's never a good thing to be in a tabloid newspaper. The article itself was okay, but the responses were out and out racist for the most part. They've actually subsequently taken them down. I had a look actually over the weekend. These are a couple of examples, you know, ridiculous. The ancient Egyptians were, as any historian who has studied accounts of the time will tell you, white Caucasian Europeans. Cleopatra was white, possibly with sun-kissed features. And then at the bottom, you can see somebody who's referencing, in my opinion, eugenics and racism in its purest form, saying that her Greek blood was undiluted. I'm not going to read this out, it's rather tedious, but I use it here to give you an impression of how the Daily Mail readers responded to that particular article. And that's fine, perhaps we don't expect any more from those people who choose to read the Daily Mail. As I've said, for those who aren't aware of it, it's a tabloid newspaper. However, when it was recently announced that an actor of Israeli heritage and descent was going to be playing Cleopatra in a new film, I was asked to comment for Newsweek, and 3 other colleagues were also asked to comment. And I think this is interesting because the first, Catherine Bard, said that Cleopatra was white of Macedonian descent, as were all of the Ptolemy rulers who lived in Egypt. That's a quote from the article. The one unresolved, perhaps unresolvable relevant issue is who is her mother. Slightly better, we see Egyptologist and colleague Betsy Bryan saying the mother of Cleopatra has been suggested from the family of priests of Memphis. In this the case, she would have been at least 50% Egyptian in origin. But what concerns me about this, and there were countless references on Twitter by Egyptologists and classicists alike, effectively saying, well, she was Macedonian Greek, she wasn't Egyptian. And for me, many of the people who were commenting were not even specialists on this period. And I struggle with that as an academic because I wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on the Old Kingdom, for instance. It's not something that I've ever specialised in. It's something that I understand the basics, but it's not something that I have spent 20 plus years investigating. Nevertheless, people seem to feel that they can make these comments, and this just adds to the problem and the persistence of refusing to look at Cleopatra as she should write, as she wanted to be seen, which is as a ruler of Egypt. My response was in the middle here. It's and I think this is important because lots of people seem to be outraged the fact that the actor who is going to be playing Cleopatra is of Israeli descent, and the problem for them was an Israeli actor playing effectively an Arab role. Well, as we know, if you look at a timeline, this is a ridiculous argument. And I did point out, and I was quoted in the same article in Newsweek, saying that Cleopatra ruled in Egypt long before the Arab settlement. And we don't really even need to get into a discussion about this. All we need to do is look at a timeline. So if we look at the evidence, we know, just to recap, that she was only represented as an Egyptian and African in Egypt, in her own country, that her presentation embodies the roles of Kemetic royal women and rulers. Her overseas presentations were adapted for a European audience. And I also commented, but it wasn't printed in the article, that actually the evidence suggests at the very least that filmmakers should have considered an actor of mixed ancestry to play the role of Cleopatra. And this would have been an absolutely valid choice looking at the evidence that we have. I think it's very disappointing that this wasn't considered. And given that Hollywood seems to say that it wants to make amends and that it wants to recognise actors and people who are involved in the film industry of African ancestry, they're missing an opportunity to do so in the making of this new film. And a final thought and a quote from Professor Shelley Haley from her 1993 piece. And she said, Cleopatra represents a contemporary Black woman's double history of oppression and survival. I would perhaps sort of tweak that ever so slightly and say that the presentation of Cleopatra has become part of that double history of oppression and survival, because the evidence is there. It seems pretty clear to me how she wanted to present herself. And yet we are choosing, both as academics, as Egyptologists, as classicists, and more broadly in contemporary cultures, to completely ignore that fact. So that was all I wanted to say. Dr. Nahousi, would you like to also add some words to conclude?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ashton. I think that you have, in closing, raised some extremely important points. And they're still with us, as you said, contemporary. And those of us who live in the United States today, and indeed anybody watching the world news, would recognize that the whole question of evidence, of being led by science, is extremely urgent in a country where millions of people are infected by COVID-19. Hundreds of thousands have died, more will die. And a lot of this has to do with the refusal to gaze at science and accept evidence. If we need any warning about how catastrophic this refusal to be truthful could be, well, we've got it in front of us today. I hope this is the ultimate. And I say this in order to say that when Europeans colonized different parts of the world, they didn't only colonize human beings, they colonized the images that those human beings used to represent themselves. And this is coming straight from John Henry Clarke. And it's important for us to understand that a lot of what we're dealing with in our field as scholars is a number of lies, omissions, and distortions about colonized people and about the colonizers also. People couldn't go to Africa where you had high morals socialized into everybody and claim that you're bringing civilization to a continent that invented civilization, or that you're Christianizing people who didn't need your Christianity because most of Christianity comes from there anyhow. So those Europeans who wanted to defend the most ungodly acts towards African people invented scripts and narrative to represent themselves. And a lot of this has been established in academia. We know this from our own experiences, that they're very, very vicious defenders of academic racism in the world today. And if we are going to be as thorough and as real, to put it this way, woke, some people would say, about all of this, I think it's important for us to understand that these are some of the issues that affect how people look at a figure like Cleopatra. And many people are not defending anything scientific, anything based on evidence. They're defending what they have been socialized into believing, which is that white people are superior and the people they're colonized are inferior. There are many variations of this, but those statements that you quoted, they amuse me because people are saying Cleopatra could not be this, but there's no evidence for it. So as we think about this, I think these are some of the issues that we need to be reflecting upon. And I just want to emphasize with you how contemporary this issue of being led by evidence and being scientific really, really is. It's not only about Cleopatra.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think you've said that perfectly, Dr. Nohousi. Absolutely, it seems to be endemic as a problem. People just making up a version of history that they want for themselves and imposing that on other people. I'll stop sharing the screen now so people can see people who are talking. No, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm trying to thank you for a great presentation, and thank you, Dr. Nohousi, for your input. And I also want to take this moment, and I'll say more, but I also want to take this moment to thank Dr. Asante and the department for, because I was remiss right at the beginning not to do that, and I should have done that, so I apologize for that. But to thank you, Dr. Asante, for wanting to host this discussion through the department, because I think it's very, very important, and I thank you for that. And I don't know if you have any words to say, because actually without you, it wouldn't have happened, so.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to say to Dr. Sally Ann Ashton and also to Dr. Professor Kamani Nohousi that I am truly happy for this presentation. And in between trying to deal with a student's situation. I did hear all the conversation, and I want to say to Dr. Sally-Ann Ashton that she represents, in my judgment, one of the vanguard people in this field, in the work that she's doing, because she's not simply repeating the hearsay that we have seen in so many books, or not just simply trying to find a party line that she could operate in. I remember not long ago, well, several years ago now, when I happened to be in Barcelona with Martin Bernal, and I asked him, how did he manage, given all the criticism that he received, to stand up to it? And one of the things that he said to me was much like what Basil Davison had said to me 15 years earlier, and that was that you pursue truth wherever it is, and you don't worry about people attacking you. And one of the things that I think that has been illustrated here, and demonstrated here at least, by Sally-Ann Ashton and Kamani Nehusi, they have demonstrated that if you take positions that's based on the evidence, what we teach, what we believe in. And I really appreciate this program. And thank you, Dr. Nadav, for your moderating it and presenting it to the number of people who have come up to listen. Thank you very much. You're muted, I think.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Asante. Before we go, before we leave, we've got questions here in the chat. So I'm hoping that Dr. Nehusi, Dr. Ashton will be able to answer them. And so would you like to look at them? Can you see them and answer these questions? And thank you very much, Ms. Wilson, for running the whole webinar. I should have thanked you at the beginning. Again, it's my own fault. Thank you, and for keeping us abreast of questions, everything. Thank you very much. And Dr. Ashton, Dr. Nehusi, will you be able to answer these questions for the audience?
Yes, there's a question. Did Cleopatra practice or embrace the spiritual system religion of ancient Kemet? Absolutely, that's the only evidence that we have. Not only did she practice, but that she was an integral part of that religion. She was necessary for the religion at the particular time. I don't know if Dr. Nehusi would like to add to that.
No, that all we could add there are the details of the practice. And I think the question is effectively answered.
A question. French colleagues allowed to continue. My colleagues from the museum at Marie-Aymont Museum did continue, but they only found Roman levels. Part of the problem was that the area that we were excavating was under a concrete car park that was being used by the Port Authority bus company as a depot, basically, where they parked their buses. And we couldn't get access to the other areas because they were privately owned. So they've actually only just published the findings, but it was only really Roman material that was found at the site. So that answers that question. And yes, prior to my PhD, there hadn't been any three-dimensional statues of Cleopatra that had been recognized. It was only representations of her on the temples that we see. As I said, predominantly at Dendera, people ignored the internal representations showing her in all of these different roles within the corridors, within the rooms at Dendera. So yes. And can you say more about Cleopatra's mother? We don't really know a great deal about them. We know that they were powerful, that they ruled for certain periods of time. And that's all we really know about them. I suspect, you know, and when I was sort of writing my PhD and writing subsequent books on Cleopatra, everybody prior to the final Cleopatra tends to be ignored. The information is limited, but we do have representations again of these women. As I showed, Cleopatra III, who's an early predecessor, she was the mother of Cleopatra's grandfather, so her great grandmother. She was a formidable woman, very strong, very powerful, and ruled with her son as the dominant ruler.
I think there is a question here about female spaces. Where is it? Right. In what period one may be able to find more information about birth spaces and other distinct female spaces in Egypt, as mentioned by Dr. Ashton? I think that's an extremely important question. It's from Shani, isn't it? And if I, well, Sally, you want to go first? Question is to you.
There's the obvious birth houses to look at, but I think again, if people take the time to actually look at the role of women on the temple reliefs and the role of female deities, there's so much information there that just hasn't been tapped into, and often is largely ignored, particularly for this period as well. So getting hold of the information, some of it can be done by sort of photographs, archives, but actually it's really a case of just going, as I did one to Dendera, and actually just going through every sort of part of that wall very, very carefully to record yourself what representations we have of the women. Dr. Nahusi?
Yeah, and I would add that it's important to recognize that a divinity and what that divinity is doing, representing, is the ancient Egyptians' way of saying, hey, this is important, this is very important, this is of the utmost importance. And if we begin with that, we begin to see how the roles of women were important to these ancient Egyptian people. But I also think that investigating female spaces has to do with a lot of the language, and a word like Nebmaatre, which means female owner of the house. I think it encourages us to see the house as a female-led zone, though not necessarily a female-dominated zone in the sense of that they were antagonistic to men. This was a woman's place. She ran things here. And there are all kinds of things that happened in the house, in the pair. You know, I'm wondering if we must even accept pair as a house only in the physical sense. This is a space that included the near abroad, if you want to call it that, the yard, the compound. And women had real power in these places. And, you know, the whole family as an institution in which different groups, well, the males as well as the females contributed and had power. These are some of the issues, I think, that we begin to understand when we contemplate those female spaces. So I would start there. There are other places you could go, of course.
There's a question regarding, Caesar deified Cleopatra. Might we observe a pattern per Herodotus, noting the beauty, intelligence, and blackness of Kemetic? Absolutely. I mean, I think what's interesting, if you look at the evidence in both Rome and Pompeii for around this time and just following the death of Caesar, there are countless sanctuaries dedicated to Egyptian deities. You know, the Romans had a huge respect for those deities, and it's clear from the wall paintings from Pompeii that the priests were Kemites, they were Egyptians. It's clear from their depictions, they're shown as with their shaven heads, with dark skin. So I think, again, some people impose their sense of what Africa is and Africanness. They try and impose that onto the Greeks and the Romans, when in actual fact, both societies celebrated that Kemet, Egypt, to them was a much older culture, and honoured some of their gods in the same way equally to their own deities, and they saw them as older deities than their own. So yes, absolutely. And I think it's hard to know what was happening in Republican Rome. It's obviously the interpretation that people were angered by Caesar's actions. You know, it was only a few years later that Octavian, you know, sort of named himself Augustus and was actually showing himself as a god. And, you know, insisting, it's interesting, if you look wherever there's a depiction of Cleopatra on a temple in Egypt, there's one of Augustus. It's almost as if he's trying to stamp his authority on where she was. So yes, I think there was certainly a great deal of respect for Egypt as an African culture by the Romans and the Greeks.
I want to add a little to that. Just reading Homer alone, I mean, where do the gods of the Greeks go for a holiday every year for 12 days? They go to Egypt, they go to Ethiopia, which is Africa. I mean, if your gods are going to go to a place for a holiday, that can't be the kind of place that has been described that in recent times, or that some people try to project it to be. And of course, there are other bits of evidence, but I just want to offer that one. You know, sometimes we read these things and the real significance of what we're reading doesn't always hit us. And certainly that's one bit of evidence that suggests exactly what you're saying, Dr. Ashton. Vanessa Davies asks a question about, and that's one purely for you, Dr. Ashton. Cleopatra is a woman, the psychological effects of her experience in family members being exiled and killed. I know you dealt with that one before, but I guess Vanessa wants you to go a little more detail.
I think it's interesting that we somehow, we forget this. We forget the, if we can put ourselves in that position, you know, Cleopatra came from an extremely violent family. Many of her predecessors had married their siblings. So naturally there's going to be an impact and an effect potentially there. The level of cruelty, if the historical sources are correct, of even her sort of great-grandparents is, you know, it sort of makes our sort of current sort of serial killers and sort of, you know, murderers, you know, seem quite tame by comparison. And I think for me, thinking about her psychologically, you know, certainly her great-grandmother had been extremely dominant as a ruler. And her mother too had also seized control with possibly her half-sister when her father was exiled. So, and I think that for me, that's reflected in how she depicted herself, that she has these different personas, which are traditional personas, looking at it from a Kemetic sort of perspective. But I think I'd also add to that she seems to have had an extreme confidence to be able to present her son, not only as her equal, but as her co-ruler. When we look at what Cleopatra III did, she was very dominant over her son when she was presenting herself, and actually he ended up killing her because he wanted control, of the country. But the final Cleopatra seems to have been quite a confident individual. There are articles written about her, you know, was she psychopathic? Did she have narcissistic personality disorder? And again, I find that slightly problematic because I do a lot of work around personality disorders as a psychologist, particularly and their association to violence. And, you know, again, we're imposing not only sort of European norms onto a figure who was from Africa, but also contemporary European norms when we're deciding whether or not she was a psychopath or not. And I think, again, it's just another example of how we look at her through a Eurocentric lens. Rather than seeing her as a powerful individual, a ruler and a strong and dominant figure, you know, people will sort of accuse her of being a psychopath. Well, again, you know, to some extent, do we see that when people are discussing male rulers? So I think it's really important to think about the psychological impact on her and how that made her who she is. But I think it's really important not to impose our kind of modern contemporary views. For me, the more interesting thing in terms of looking at psychology is how people respond to her, particularly when we reference her as an African. That's interesting because at the very least we're seeing dissonance. At the very worst we're seeing out and out sort of racism.
There's a question here. Do you or Dr. Kemetic can tell us about the cobra on the bow?
So the cobra protected typically the king, also his consort, the royal wife. It's a sign of royalty, but it represents the protection of the sun god Ra, protecting the ruler. The cobra becomes multiple, and many people will know, and there are better experts on this particular subject than myself. I'm thinking of Solange on the 25th dynasty, where we have the rulers using 2 cobras. For females, I wrote an article on this a long time ago, and as I said, it doesn't seem to be associated with one particular title, but it does seem to be associated with a hierarchy, so the more dominant role. And as I've said, sometimes it has, it's been suggested it might be the unification of the 2 lands. Sometimes we see a cobra and a vulture representing Upper and Lower Egypt, but sometimes we see the 2 cobras. So we see it often in the women of the 25th dynasty, but also earlier in some of the more dominant women of the 18th dynasty. And that's the earliest I've found the double cobra for females. So it's protected, but it also seems to represent status of a particular individual.
Unless you do, there's also a question from Dr. Kimika Witherspoon here. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was really interesting when because they filmed me talking for about a day about Cleopatra, and I said that I would only be involved in the documentary if they would show her as a woman of mixed ancestry, because that was how, as somebody who studied her, I saw her. So they agreed to that. But what was interesting was that they lost the footage that they had spent a day recording, and rather than asking me to return from Cambridge to London for another day, they asked another Egyptologist who wasn't herself a specialist in Cleopatra to talk about her. And I suspect it was because I wasn't conforming, this is only a suspicion, I don't know for sure, I wasn't conforming to what they wanted me to say. I was being very careful about how I responded to their questions, and that footage was lost. The only thing that they did include, and they included it inaccurately, was how I had worked with the people to do the reconstruction. They said that it was from a coin, and it wasn't, it was from that statue that I showed. And actually, interestingly, the amount of hate emails I've received over the years has been remarkable. And there are hate videos about me on the internet, and I've appeared as an object of hatred on extremist websites as well. So I still get hate mails, hate emails, hate messages posted to my blog, Kemet Expert, and I think, as Dr. Asante said, you know, what can you do? I'm not prepared to sit here and lie about historical figure just for the sake of to placate racists and nationalists. I'm not prepared to do that. I'm an academic, and I personally feel that that would be wrong.
Thank you, Sally Ann. I know that you've had hate mail and murderous ideas of what could happen to you and things like that. So, you know, the school itself wants to maintain some kind of hope. The culture itself wants to maintain the same beliefs about African people. It's in their interest to do so. So it is the work of people that want to challenge that to have to take into account these types of threats on the lives of those that challenge the perceptions and constructions of who we actually are. So, you know, anyway, I think that we're coming towards the end of a really excellent presentation, Dr. Ashton and Dr. Kamani, and I want to thank you on behalf of the department for your very important work. And again, as unless you have anything that you would like to say, I would also like to thank Dr. Asante for promoting the idea here. I think it's great when we can bring people together, information together that is important to the discipline to continue to learn about our identities, who we are, our cultural ideas, and you clearly show that Cleopatra was an African woman because she practiced African cultural beliefs, and her family married into the African families, in the sense of you can't be a proper Kemite unless you're part of the actual you know, families that came before you. So there was that link, and supporting cultural beliefs and values and living inside them, you know, moves us away from the racialization, because, you know, that can't accommodate that. It's impossible to accommodate cultural beliefs and values and changes within it. And so I thank you. And again, to say thank you to Ms. Wilson for bringing the whole webinar thing together, for getting the pictures, the technical knowledge of how to do this, getting us all in there. And, you know, she's very humble. I don't know if you would say anything, Ms. Wilson. You're muted.
I'm sorry. It was a great presentation. I got a lot of feedback, and all of your questions that have not been answered, I will be sending to Sally Ann and, well, to the team for later responses. So look forward to them. All right. Thank you so much for a great presentation.
And Dr. Asante, final words to close down? And I shouldn't forget Tahaka Ade for putting this onto the Facebook and making sure that all the technology worked, because he worked with Miss Wilson to make sure these final pieces are in place. So thank you very much, Tahaka. And
yeah, all I can say is Ankh Jed Sanab. Great presentation. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Blessings and love.